It's midsummer and your garden is probably bursting by this point. Well, one of the challenges with our garden is how do we prolong that harvest and enjoy it more than just when it's available to us in the garden. With our vegetables and fruits, we can often can or pickle those to preserve them. But another group of plants that's often bountiful this time of year is our herbs. And really, if we're going to preserve our herbs, one of the best ways to do that is through drying. And we want to harvest our herbs first thing in the morning after the dew has dried off of the leaves. When it's time to harvest your herbs, you typically want to prune from the top upper growth of your plant. And also those oils get a little bit more pungent right before they bloom. So if you've already noticed blooms, it might be a little past, but you can still harvest them. Now, you want to harvest from the top of the plant because that's where you often have cleaner, newer, supple growth. Down in the base of the plant, a lot of times you'll have less air circulation, so you're more prone to diseases and things like that. Insects like to hide in there. Also, you might see more damage on the leaves. And another thing is there'll be more soil on those leaves just from the irrigation and the splashing up on those leaves. So try to harvest from the top. Now, depending on what type of herb you're harvesting will kind of dictate how you're going to go about harvesting that. Some, like thyme, you might want to give it more of a haircut where you just kind of clip a little bit of it off. Something with basil that has a little bit larger stems and larger vegetation, you're going to selectively go in and pick out branches that are about 6 to 8 inches long. Now, you don't necessarily want to harvest your whole plant unless you know there's an approaching frost or freeze coming. In that case, take as much as you can so you can prolong your garden through the coming season. So after you've harvested, now hopefully you've picked off any diseased leaves that you see or anything like that, but we're going to go ahead and rinse these because basically we're going to dry them and then use them for cooking purposes. So giving them a quick rinse, we're just going to kind of, you can do this under the kitchen sink if you wanted to, but just sort of wash them off. That helps kind of remove any dust or soil that might be on them. So you're just going to lay these out and allow them to dry. Basically right now we're working on just getting the surface of those leaves dry. We've rinsed the soil off of them. And as we wait for those to just dry on the surface, we're going to gather a few supplies. So you want to get some rubber bands, a hole punch or some scissors. Also maybe a couple of jars depending on what kind of jar you want to store your herbs in, whether you're going to store them as stems or just smaller leaves. Think about that. You want to have something to label your jars with, also a marker to write on there, and some paper bags. And I'll tell you why you're going to need these here in a second. So we've got some rosemary down here that we've already allowed to dry off. We've washed it and dried it, and so we have these. Now we're going to just take these stems and sort of bundle them together. You're going to take about anywhere from 5 to 8 stems. You can see if I had cut these down here, but I cut them up higher, so we've got several stems in here. So you just kind of want to bundle them together and allow for there to be good airflow around here. So if it's got more vegetation, you might want to do fewer stems. If it has smaller vegetation, then you could use more stems. So again, we're just going to check, make sure there's nothing on here that we don't want, and then we're going to take our rubber band and our stems and just basically bind them together. And you're going to wrap it pretty good because those stems will shrink as they lose their moisture. So we've got a pretty tight stem there. You might kind of pull these out a little bit to allow that airflow to get in and around the stems. And then at this point, we're just going to take one of our strings, tie a string around them, and now we can hang those up. Now, the location is important because you want to make sure, a lot of times you might think, oh, I need to put them in the sun so that they can really dry out, but actually you want to put them in a dry, warm, dark location. So a shed or an attic or your garage actually works really well. If you have a shady location, such as somewhere like this, in the trees even would work. Another way to dry them is on a laundry rack. If you want to just find a location in your house, a closet or something that still has some good airflow to it, that might work as well. But again, you want it to be dry, not humid, because humidity will cause them to mold. So we're just going to tie them on here, and those will dry. Now it takes about anywhere from a week to 3 weeks depending on your location. So now if you also have something that has finer textured leaves that you're worried will drop as it's drying, or you're perhaps drying to save the seeds, you might want to think about putting your herbs, your bundle of herbs, in a paper sack. The paper sack should be hole punched so that it has holes in it. You want to make sure just to hole punch the sides and not the bottom, so that as anything falls, it will collect that. So you can get different hole punches. You can see I've done this already, but if you hole punch the side here, when you open this up to then place your herbs in, you can see you actually have a lot more holes. And this is just fun for kids. Also, you might want to go ahead and label it while it's in the sack, so that in case you don't recognize your herb later on, you can do that now. But we're simply going to slip our bundle of drying herbs into our sack here. And again, we're going to get a string and tie it up around the stems of that herb that's in there. All right, so you can see our string and our stems are still hanging out the top of it. Our herbs are drying upside down, and now we can hang this in our warm, dry location. The reason why we punched holes is to allow for good air circulation to flow around that plant. So again, we're not worried about any mildew or mold, hopefully, inside this sack. And also, again, the bottom of our hole or our sack is not punched, so that it will collect anything that may fall. The other benefit to putting your herbs in a brown paper sack is that if you're worried about dust settling on your herbs as they're drying, that'll help alleviate that concern as well. Now, another method of drying herbs is using a screen. If you have a screen, you can use whatever you really have that works. You can buy this screening material and make something, or a stand. This is just an old window screen we've used here. And this actually works better on some larger leaf things. So here we've got some basil, and you can just lay these basil leaves out. Now, while you want good air circulation, you're going to have to be cautious about this because the wind might blow all of these away. So be aware of that. But you can then just place this out in a location to allow them to dry also. Now, I really enjoy this method of drying, but it can take some time, usually again about a week to 3 weeks, depending on your location and your herbs. So there are other methods of drying herbs, including using a conventional oven. The concern about using a conventional oven is a lot of times your setting won't go low enough. You want to bake them at below 110 degrees, and so you often will have to keep your oven door open, and that'll still take up to 3 to 4 hours, and so that might be a little bit of a long period of time, regularly checking those to make sure they're not getting too hot in there. Now, a better method that might be a little faster than hanging them or putting them on a screen is to use a food dehydrator. Now, all food dehydrators are a little bit different, so you're going to want to check your owner's manual as far as what setting is best for herbs. So we've got some rosemary that has dried here, and we're going to go ahead and now process it for storage. So you can see it's pretty crispy. The thing about herbs is the more you break them down, crunch them, grind them, the more they're going to lose the flavor that you're after. So it's best to store them as whole stems if you can. Putting them in a airtight container is important. So I've got just a jar here that I'm going to put them in. It's best if you can put them in a dark colored jar, but if you don't have one, that's fine, this works. So we're just going to drop in a few whole stems. You might have to break some of them in half, but that's fine. But they're going to store a lot better as whole stems than they would if they were crunched up. Of course, we could fill this up with more, but I'm just demonstrating here. We're going to go ahead and seal these up. Now, you can see this is going to take up a lot more space for herbs. And if that's too much space, more than you want to dedicate, then you might look for a smaller jar. And what you would do in this situation is go ahead and strip the stem and just put your leaves in there. So you can see, obviously, this is going to take up a little less space. But again, we're going to seal that in an airtight container. We want to make sure that we label whatever container we're using. And so we've just got some labels here that we're going to go ahead and put on our jar. Make sure to include what the herb is and also the date. So now that you've got them in your airtight jars, you're not quite finished just yet. After a couple of days, you want to check them and make sure that you're not seeing any condensation or moisture inside the jar. If you are, then that means that your herbs weren't completely dried thoroughly, and that could lead to mold, which is not a good thing. So at that point, if you're seeing moisture, or if you already see any sort of signs of mold, you want to go ahead and throw those out and start all over again with those. But keep in mind, this is a great way to preserve your herbs from the summer throughout those coming months. Once they are stored properly, they're going to last about a year. So you'll be able to enjoy your herbs throughout the year. Those winter months, you can be reminded of your summer garden. Now you want to make sure to store these in a dark place. So even if you've got glass jars or a dark jar, you want to make sure to go ahead and store them in a dark location, such as your cupboard. Not near your stove, which often will provide some heat to them, or anything that might add moisture around your kitchen sink. So put them in a dry, dark location and they'll keep up to a year. Remember also, the more you dry your herbs, they're going to be more pungent to use when you're cooking. So about 1/4 teaspoon of ground herbs equals a teaspoon of crumbled herbs, which equals a tablespoon of fresh herbs. So keep that in mind with your recipes as you're cooking with your dried herbs as well. The other thing is, even if you're not a cook, this is really a fun activity to get your kids involved, to learn about plants, to learn about preserving plants or seeds. And like I said, you can even dry some flowers if you just want to add a little fragrance into your dried flower arrangement or your potpourri.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.